I talked about the impacts of climate change, and I was talking about them at the global mean. And nobody lives at the global mean. Very few people earn the world average income. So what do we know about the distribution of income? What you're looking at here is essentially the same exercise as in the previous graph. It took all the available estimates with a bit of imputation by country, took the average of them, and those are the blue dots, and then the bars around them are the 95% confidence interval, or essentially the spread between estimates. And what you see, the vertical axis is again the welfare equivalent income loss. The horizontal axis is per capita income in the year 2005. And what you see is that poorer countries tend to suffer higher impacts proportional to their income than the richer countries. There's three reasons for that. One is exposure. Poorer people, poorer economies tend to have a larger share in agriculture and things that are otherwise directly exposed to weather and climate, whereas richer countries do different things. So if you're a logistics firm or you're a bank, then you may be vulnerable to all sorts of stuff, but weather and climate are not at the top of your list. Whereas if you're a farmer, then weather is one of the things at the top of the list to worry about. So that is a simple mechanical reason. The second reason is that poorer countries tend to be in hotter places. And I'll come back to that this afternoon, whether that's causal or not. But the simple fact is that poorer countries tend to be in hotter places, and that is what you see depicted on this graph. It's the same information, but now plotted against the current mean temperature. And what you see is that impacts are larger and more negative in places that are currently hotter. Some of it is because plants and things are closer to their biological or biophysical limits. Part of it has to do with the possibilities of adaptation. If you live in Amsterdam and you wonder what would the world be like if it were 3 degrees warmer, then you could look at what is the world like in Bordeaux. And you could wonder, how should I adapt? You could look at things such as siestas. You could look at how did they design their buildings there. Buildings in the Netherlands are designed to keep the heat in. Buildings in Spain are designed to keep the heat out. In a world that is 3, 4, 5 degrees warmer, the Netherlands would be more like southern Spain, and therefore we should adopt their lifestyles and have dinner at midnight. If you live in the hottest place on the planet, you cannot look to an even hotter place. How should I adapt? Right? You have to invent everything from scratch, which is necessarily more complicated than copying somebody else. So that is another reason why poorer countries tend to be more vulnerable. The third reason, and that's more interesting to have, is that poorer countries tend to have a more limited adaptive capacity. So what is adaptive capacity? Just a fancy word for the ability to adapt. Something changes and you have to deal with it. Some societies will be better able to handle this than others. People have come up with lists of what is adaptive capacity and what drives adaptive capacity. The first in that list is always the availability of technological options. If you're confronted with sea level rise and you don't like that, then the question is, what can you do about that? And then the thought may come up in your head, I need to build a dike. If you don't know that there are such things as dikes, you are less able to cope with sea level rise. If you are aware of this, dikes are a pretty primitive technology. We actually don't know when they were first invented. People reckon it was probably 5,000 years ago somewhere in China. But there are, of course, much more fancy methods available for coastal protection. If you don't believe me, just travel access to these technologies, then you're better able to cope with sea level rise. And if you don't have access to these technologies, then typically poor societies are constrained in their access to technology. Second big component of adaptive capacity is your ability to pay for the application of these technologies. And that may actually, in the case of sea level rise, be a more important constraint. Because if you don't have these technologies in-house, what you can do is call up the guys from Deltares, one of the big consulting firms in Delft, and they will happily help you out in sorting out how you should protect yourself against anything, right? For a fee, of course. So in the case of coastal protection, it's not for the ability to pay, then the unavailability of technology. This is not a technology that is in any way constrained by military purposes or anything. There's no sanctions on this. And then there's a whole cluster of softer things that may be even more important than the ability to pay, than just the resources that are there. One example is Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a low-lying country, very densely populated, vulnerable to floods from the river, it's vulnerable to floods from the sea. Occasionally a big storm comes and tries to blow everything away. And Bangladesh has just not been very well able to cope with it. We're in the Netherlands, right? It's a low-lying country. There's risk of floods from the sea and the river, and occasionally a big storm comes. Very densely populated. And in the Netherlands, these things are annoying, but not life-threatening. And you can sort of say, well, the Netherlands is much richer, but that is actually not a good explanation at all. The Netherlands started its big dike building program, stuff that keeps our feet dry, keeps us safe from the sea in 1850. And in 1850, the Netherlands wasn't much richer than Bangladesh is today. And Bangladesh nowadays has much greater technological resources, technological options than the Netherlands had then. Right? You look at old movies of how the Afsluitdijk was built, it was by hand and with steam-driven drag lines. Bangladesh has much better technology than the Netherlands had when it started building it. The reasons lie in politics and the way society is organized and all those soft things such as human capital and social capital and how decisions are made and who counts and who doesn't. If you look at the distribution of income spatially in Bangladesh and the distribution of flood risks in Bangladesh, then you would see that it's the poor who suffer from floods. It's the poor people who live on the coastal flats, the poor people who live on the river flats, and the rich people and the powerful people live in higher places and are much safer. Bangladesh is nominally a democratic country, but the elites don't really care about the poor people. The elites are actually, the political elites in Bangladesh are occupying their time with two things. One is self-enrichment, and the other is getting even with their political opponents. That seems to occupy most of their time. Bangladesh typically ranks as one of the most corrupt and one of the worst governed countries in the world. And if a storm wipes away 10,000 poor people, that doesn't really matter because they actually think that this is punishment from Allah rather than the incompetence of the government. And by next election, you can always bribe the poor to vote for you anyway. So the way the country is governed does not really actually means that the powers that be don't really care about these problems. So why would they want to solve their flood problems? It's not their issue. It's the issue of the poor souls who are living on the planet. And that may be really what is holding back flood protection in Bangladesh, rather than not knowing how to build a dike and not being able to pay for it. Now, why did flood protection start in 1850 in the Netherlands? What happened the year before, 1849, there was constitutional reform. Thorbecke. What happened before that, the European Spring of 1848. So Netherlands regularly suffered devastating floods, killing thousands, if not more people. Then the Thorbecke Constitution brought in a strong central government that was actually able to do something against this, as opposed to the fractured governments that the Netherlands had before. And it brought in a government that was broadly representative of the will of the people, if you include males and Protestants only. And as soon as that happened, the government went after public enemy number one, which was flood. So the fact that we're so well protected here against floods is because we have a government that can and a government that cares. And that is not true in Bangladesh. And that is, I mean, these are just two stories, right? But that is symptomatic across developing countries, that the government is either incompetent or it doesn't care or both, right? And that makes you very vulnerable to any sort of change, including climate change. This has implications. This has implications big time for two things. One, how do we look at the impacts of climate change, but also how do we look at climate policy? Because if we say that adaptive capacity and vulnerability to climate change more generally depends on development, and we look at these scenarios of emissions and we see that there's a lot of economic growth, then it immediately follows that future vulnerability to climate change will be very different than today's vulnerability to climate change. So that throws in another degree of freedom into what the future may look like. And to underline this point, we're going to talk about malaria. What you're looking at here is a map of the change, because of climate change, in the prevalence of the risk of getting malaria. And in the yellows, the risk of malaria increases by 50% or so, and then in the reds, go up to a doubling of the risk. And then the whites mean no change. If you look very, very carefully, then you also see some greens, and that's actually where the risk of malaria would decrease. Now, why is this? The greens are, there are really greens on the map. Why do we think this is the case? Two reasons. One, the malaria parasite develops faster if it's hotter. Unless it gets very hot, but that is a bit outside of the range of projections. But if it gets warmer, then the disease simply develops faster. Mosquitoes also become more active if it's warmer, and mosquitoes breed more easily if it's wetter, because mosquitoes need small puddles of warm, still standing water to have babies. So in a world that is warmer and wetter, you would expect more malaria. That's the future. This is today. Another map. There's 5 colors on this map. In red, we're looking at those areas of the world where there is malaria. In yellow, we're looking at those areas of the world where there could be malaria, but there isn't. And then in blue and in green and in white, we're looking at those areas where there can't be malaria, because it's too cold for the parasite and too dry for the mosquitoes. What is the difference between the red and the yellow? The red bits are poor, the yellow bits are rich. Malaria nowadays is a disease of poverty, a tropical disease. That wasn't always. The guy who founded this country, still in the silence, suffered from the other day fever, malaria. George Washington did not want Washington DC to be built on the marshes of the Potomac because of the malaria risk. Malaria was a big thing for the Allies who invaded southern Italy, because malaria was endemic in southern Italy until 1946. So why has this changed? What has changed? Actually, 3 things have changed. One is malaria medicine. The life cycle of the malaria parasite demands that it spends time in a human host, in a mosquito host, in a human host, in a mosquito host. if you treat the human with malaria medicine, two things happen. One, you suppress the symptoms of malaria, which is why you do it. But also, you make the human less infectious. You can't infect other people anymore if you take them the proper malaria medicine. So that is one reason. And then if you treat enough people, you create herd immunity. Second reason, more important, are clouds of DDT. So immediately after World War II, we covered malarious areas in DDT, and all the mosquitoes died. We kept that program up for a couple of decades until environmentalists said, no, perhaps DDT is not very good. The third reason goes back to the warm, still standing water. We drained the swamps, taking away a lot of mosquito habitat. We paved our roads and put proper roofs on our houses. And once you start properly surfacing roads, then you take away the potholes, you take away the puddles of warm, still standing water. And again, you reduce the mosquito habitat, and particularly close to where the people are. And those are the reasons why in 2015, rich people don't die of malaria, only poor people do. And on this map, it is pretty stark. If you know something about the distribution of income in Brazil, you would actually be able to tell the same story again. Now, what does that imply for the future? We're here looking at a range of scenarios. In blue, so on the horizontal axis, we're looking at time. On the vertical axis, we're looking at the number of people dying of malaria because of climate change. So the total death toll of malaria is about 500,000 people per year. And we reckon that that number would have been about 75,000 lower if climate hadn't changed in the last century. Now, this is no way of validating the models, because nobody has a death certificate that says he or she died of climate change or climate change induced malaria. In fact, most people that die of malaria don't have death certificates at all. Right? And the 500,000 is an estimate. It's an observation. So about 75,000 per year today, and if climate is the only thing that changes, then that would go up to about 250,000, perhaps 300,000 by the end of the century. And then the dotted lines indicate the uncertainty about the malaria model. It's a sizable number, right? 250,000 people dying each year. It's fairly small compared to the number of people who die of air pollution in China and India today. Right? So even if this number is true, then climate change is still not a bigger environmental problem than air pollution. And this is climate change in 100 years from now. Right? And air pollution is today. Coming back to an earlier. Now, that's in black. That's when climate is the only thing that's changing. Then the green curve, population growth is added, and then we're talking about 750,000 people dying each year because of climate change-induced malaria, and then numbers become worrying, and therefore this is the number that you would see bandied about in the media. Now, this green line does not include economic growth, and in the previous slide, we found that rich people don't die of no malaria. And if you look coarsely at the data, you would see that everybody with above the threshold of $3,000 per person a year would not get malaria. Or if they would get malaria, they would not die of it. Now, if we impose that relationship as well, we end up in the red curve, where because of economic growth, and therefore because of improvements in public health care, environmental management, the disease is eradicated around the year 2085. Right? Obviously, this is hugely uncertain, but that is the pattern. The pattern is also uncertain, not just because economic growth is uncertain, because the relationship between economic development and public health care is uncertain, or rather it differs across the world, and that is shown in the purple and orange curves. In in the orange, we impose the condition, or we impose the assumption that healthcare spending will be much more like it is in communist countries. In communist countries, for their level of income, tend to spend much more on public health care than do capitalist countries. And if the whole world were to adopt a Cuban pattern of spending, then we would end up in the orange curve, and malaria would be eradicated much sooner. Problem is that malaria is concentrated in Africa, and African countries tend to spend less on public health care than you would expect given the level of development. And then you find the same pattern, right? We end up in the purple curve, but the turning point comes much, much later. To illustrate how uncertain these things really are, right? And the number of assumptions and questionable assumptions that you need to make. Now, in these scenarios, three things are changing. Climate is changing, population is growing, income is changing, but medical technology is not. So in the final scenario, in light blue, I take Bill Gates for his word. Bill Gates founded Microsoft, became incredibly rich, and is now following Carnegie's example and trying to give away all his money before he dies. Right? He has so much money for the country that he succeeds. And one of the things that the Gates Foundation is doing is developing a malaria. And they set themselves a target for 2020. And the assumption here is that unlike Microsoft operating systems, it will actually be delivered in time. It took 20 years to roll out the polio vaccine across the world. So that's the assumption that you see here, the malaria vaccine comes on the market in 2020, and in 2040 the disease is eradicated. And it's not just climate change induced malaria that is eradicated in 2040 in this scenario, but it's all malaria. Bill Gates succeeds. 10 years ago, people said, you cannot invent a malaria vaccine. It's too complicated. The disease is not a single disease. It's a complex of afflictions. You can't invent a malaria vaccine. Last year, they went on trial. So maybe 2020 is a realistic goal. Who knows? But you see the complications that you need to do if you're projecting the impacts of climate change. All the different assumptions you need to make in order to make it tick, and the wide range of results that comes out. Right? There's also policy implications, and I prefer to refer to those as the Schelling conjecture. So back in the day, when Schelling was just an eminent economist rather than a Nobel laureate in the early 90s, he got interested in climate. Well, he actually got interested a bit earlier, but he returned to climate policy, and Schelling, being a very naughty man, asked two very pertinent questions. Most greenhouse gas emissions come from rich countries. Most climate action is supposed to come from rich countries. Most impacts of climate change fall on poor countries and in the future. So that implies that the benefits of climate policy primarily fall on the children and grandchildren of Bangladeshis, people in Cameroon, people in Nigeria. Not on your kids. They would benefit much less from greenhouse gas emission reduction. So that is almost a statement of fact. And then Schelling went on to ask, why do we care about these people? Why do we care about the grandchildren of Bangladeshis when it's not at all obvious that we care about the Bangladeshis themselves? If you look at our aid policies, the charities that we do to help poor countries grow, that doesn't suggest that we care a whole lot about them. Some people do. The majority doesn't. If you look at our trade policies, if you look at our immigration policies, you look at all the things that are going on across the Mediterranean, you may come away with the conclusion that we actively hate poor people and we want to hurt them as much as we can. That is the truth of how we behave. So why do we care about their grandchildren? It's a very warped system of values. As I said, Schelling is a naughty man. He also, suspending his disbelief for a moment, continued to ask the second question that you see here. If we care so much about the impacts of climate change on the grandchildren of the current poor, is greenhouse gas emission reduction really the best way forward? If we want to avoid those impacts, if we want to minimize those impacts, is greenhouse gas emission reduction really the best way forward? Or are there other ways? Now, going back to this curve, what does greenhouse gas emission reduction do? It puts it down this one. With a delay at a time. You could also take that money and accelerate medical progress. And then you bring about the blue line. Greenhouse gas emission reduction goes after the climate part of malaria, but would leave baseline malaria intact. Medical technology would go after all malaria and would probably deliver it, would be able to deliver it much faster. So why would you want to spend money on greenhouse gas emission reduction if you can solve the problem by developing vaccines? That's essentially the question that Schelling asked. Or more generally, is adaptation assistance a better way to reduce the impacts of climate change? Now, if we are indeed in a situation where all problems that come about with climate change are like malaria, then the answer to Schelling's question, I think, is pretty obvious. We should go for better medical technology rather than greenhouse gas emissions. But in the example of sea level rise in Bangladesh, I hope I've made it clear that money is not necessarily the answer to this. Yeah, sometimes the problems are much deeper rooted. Right? You'll say the problem in Bangladesh is a shitty government. That's the root cause of the problem, so that is what they should be focusing on. If we solve that, then they're much less vulnerable to climate change and much better off in general. And there's a bit of a disconnect there. Other issues, impact on ecosystems, the only solution is greenhouse gas emission reduction. Almost the only solution is greenhouse gas emission reduction. The alternative would be gardening and a planetary scale. So, for some examples, the answer to the Schelling conjecture is simple, right? Spend your money on solving the actual problem, forget about climate. In other cases, it's not at all clear that the problem is even connected to climate change or even connected to, because it's the Bangladeshis, you need to sort out the government. It's not something that the West is particularly good at doing, right? Regime change is not something that we have positive experience with. And development assistance has proven to be spectacularly difficult over the last 60 years of trying. Right? It depends a little bit who you believe. If you're a fan of Bill Easterly, then you would conclude that roughly 100% of development aid that we've given has been a complete waste, if not counterfactual. Whereas if you listen to less pessimistic people, then they would say that 95% of the money has been wasted. And 5% has been well targeted. So, not at all clear in many cases what you would really answer. And then there's, of course, the issue that, overall, poverty implies vulnerability. That is not the case everywhere. For instance, richer people put greater value on health impacts and put greater value on environment, partly because of higher ability to pay, but partly also because they seem to have more time to care about these things and worry about these things. Richer people also tend to live longer, and that makes them more vulnerable to debates. That's a sign of affluence. You make it long enough to worry about these things. And of course, we have just more stuff than we by air conditioning and that sort of stuff. That would also make us more vulnerable, and it will also add directly and indirectly to the warmth on the planet. So, Schelling's conjecture, the second part of it, are there better solutions to these problems? I don't think there's a general answer. Yes, no. Really depends from case to case, but it is a question that is worth asking. Unfortunately, as I said, Schelling is typically considered to be a naughty man, and it's not the question that a lot of people in climate policy would like to ask, because it distracts attention away from greenhouse gas emission reduction and all the climate revolution of the capitalist system and all that sort of bullshit. But I think objectively we should be looking at least trying to answer this question. That's all I had to say for this morning. I'll see you guys in the afternoon.